So I'd like to begin with a breathing exercise. So be comfortable. Feet on the floor is always advisable. Things in your hand I find it distracting. Of course, I have a book in my hand right now. This breathing exercise is from Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And he has a series of meditations in this book called No Mud, No Lotus. And these 4 breathing meditations put together as one all focus on the body, which is appropriate given our topic today. So first, just take some deep breaths in and out. As you breathe in, say to yourself, I am aware of my in-breath. And as you breathe out, say to yourself, I am aware of my out-breath. And do that a few times. And now follow your in-breath and out-breath closely. Breathing in, I follow my in-breath all the way through. Breathing out, I follow my out-breath all the way through. Breathing in, I follow my in-breath all the way through. Breathing out, I follow my out-breath all the way through. And now breathing in, I am aware of my whole body. Breathing out, I am aware of my whole body. Breathing in, I am aware of my whole body. Breathing out, I am aware of my whole body. And lastly, breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I calm my body. Next week in this space, the Reverend Dr. Velda Love will be leading us in further reflections and conversations about our journey to be an anti-racist congregation, encountering, reflecting on our own personal attitudes about that, and also how we move forward together as a congregation. Velda will also be leading on Saturday a workshop from 3 to 5 here at the church. And then she'll also be preaching next Sunday morning. The Reverend Derek Jackson, welcome Derek, is the Director of Education for the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association and an affiliated community minister with Second Unitarian Church in Chicago. Do they still affectionately call it 2U?
Yes.
He is one of the authors in the book Centering, Navigating Race, Authenticity, and Power in Ministry. Derek is a trained Our Whole Lives leader and active in DRUMM, D-R-U-U-M-M, the Unitarian Universalist Ministry for People of Color. He is also the treasurer and workshop leader for Healing Moments, a ministry for caregivers for people with Alzheimer's. In his free time, Derek likes to knit and to be involved in theater. He is married to my friend and colleague, the Reverend James Olson, a United Church of Christ minister. and lives with their 2 cats, Merlin and Morgana. That was carefully worded. Welcome, Derek.
I was on the faculty of Meadville Lombard Theological School, which is the Unitarian Universalist seminary in Chicago. And so my teaching style is much more collaborative, conversational, in the sense of there's wisdom within the room. I'm not the only person who knows things, and you are a group of smart people, and you have things to share. So this will be very much a collaborative process today. And first I wanted to start because this is part of a series, to build off of last week. As you talked about some of the theological foundations of sexuality and ethics, and talked about why the conversation matters. And I would love to hear your reflections from last week of what were the things that resonated with you, what kind of surfaced in your conversation last week. Yes.
That's probably a very loaded question.
And why is that?
Because it requires us to express our vulnerabilities and question and biases in answering it.
Right. Well, I hope that this is a safe space, and those, if you do not feel comfortable in actually engaging, feel free to not share as well. So I think this is a place, I believe in learning spaces are places where that we need to be vulnerable in order to be able to have our deepest learning. So, but I also know that the level of that vulnerability differs from person to person and situation to situation. So if we're not in the space to be able to do that, feel free to not share, but I hope that this space can be a space that we can share openly about the things that we are talking about and from our hearts. Yes.
I was struck last week about how this isn't a one and done conversation, that there might be multiple conversations with your child, and I'm interested in finding out more about what that entails.
Thank you. Yes.
I liked last week when the phrase was said that you don't learn English in one night, you don't learn human sexuality in one night. I thought that was fabulous.
Yes. Good. Yes.
Just the lack of discussion about sexuality, particularly with all of us when we were children. It was almost, and totally ignored by the church. Totally ignored by the church.
Right.
And how damaging that is.
Right.
I also learned that apparently it wasn't a punishment. It was a punishment when it refers to Sodom and Gomorrah. I thought it was something that they did. It was something that against God, but from what he explained, the people were humiliated.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand what I'm saying? You explained that the men there were dehumanized. They were brought down to female level.
Oh, I think you're referring to the article by Walter Wink.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we didn't discuss that, but it was in that article.
Right.
Yes. Thank you. That's kind of helpful getting some. Oh, I just saw your hand.
No, I just wanted to reflect on the way I was in my early teens, especially. I had been inculcated by my family and my immediate culture into thinking that those people who don't have the same sexuality as the normal people do have something wrong with them. I remember when I was in a large apartment building in my early teens, I was up there to see a friend and we were walking downstairs, and my friend told me, "Please be quiet. There's a lesbian living in that apartment." Scared the shit out of me. I have evolved.
Good point, John. The word normal, we know now is normative. Your normal? What is normal to you?
That's
Nobody cares.
Also, when I was being trained as a psychologist, homosexuality was diagnosed fantastic.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
things have changed a lot since
Yes.
then.
Since what year?
Fortunately.
Yes.
Well, to spin off on that, I remember many decades ago, I was teaching psychology, and I had saved a pair of articles from the Ladies' Home Journal, the famous journal that all women read in the 50s and 40s. And one was characteristics, the title was, of male personalities, and things that women should be aware of. The next month came out, and the heading of the one about what you should understand about women, the title was "The Peculiarities of Women's Personality." And that was in the women's magazine.
Right.
The list was a mile long.
Right.
I will never forget, I saved that.
Mm,
That's part of
yes.
the psychology course,
Right.
to highlight how goofy we can be. But I was ahead of my time in the 50s.
Great. And that kind of shows that the conversation has changed over time. And as we learn and grow, and we need to continue to learn and grow, that there is not just one kind of understanding of sexuality, and it encompasses many different things. And so I am an Our Whole Lives trainer, and Our Whole Lives is a sexuality education program that was developed by the United Church of Christ and Unitarian Universalists. And it's a comprehensive sexuality education program that is developmental across the ages. So there's a program for kindergarten and first, there's one for 4th through 6th, 6th through 9th, 10th through 12th, young adults, and then there's an older adults version that they're actually coming out with as well. So it really brings these issues to talk about that there's not just one point in our life that we need to talk about sex and sexuality, and we need to do it so it's developmentally appropriate, so that we're actually engaging, because the questions that the middle school, which is the class that I taught, are engaging with is very different than the conversations that, as adults, we would want to have. But yet we still need to have some of the same conversations, because there are things that, as you kind of talked about growing up, we didn't talk about these things. These weren't part of the conversations, and there are things that we've kind of learned, and there are things that we never actually got to learn. And to have that space to actually say, I've really had this question, and I just never had the opportunity to ask it, and to really pull apart in a deeper way sexuality and sex and what that means is really important. And so our conversation today comes out of the framework of Our Whole Lives. I think you all have the brochure, and I just want to lift up the program values, because I think those are really important.
So that's this one.
Yes, the What's Religious About Sexuality Education. And in this program, the first important value is self-worth. And the idea behind that is recognizing that we all have our worth in understanding our bodies, and our bodies are beautiful, our bodies are wonderful. We have worth, our questions are honored, that there are not stupid questions, they're not silly questions, and they're able to sit there and listen to one another and engage. The other value is around sexual health, recognizing that the lack of information that we receive doesn't help us have healthy sexual lives or understand sexuality in a healthy way. And so the education is really important to understand the health of it. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some broader definitions of sexuality and sexual health. But just to really that we need to be in conversation, and the learnings that we can receive help us lead healthier lives. Responsibility is another value. And embedded in the program is really talking about, so what is responsible behavior? How do you set your boundaries? How do you understand what is appropriate and not? How do you recognize inappropriate touch? How do you recognize what you are willing to do and what you're not willing to do, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. How does faith, and with all of the OWL program, it's written as a secular program with faith components that can be added in. And so one of the questions about responsibility is, what does your faith tell you about what is responsible sex? Yes?
Could you comment about responsibility in terms of how society, quote, society, the law, science act with that?
Yes, well, I think that is part of the kind of the conversation. What do the laws say? What does our ethics and morality and our values in the church say? What do we say? And how do those have are in conversation with one another? There's difference is in all those three areas. The conversation is very different. And so sometimes we recognize that there are laws that exist that when we look at it say that, this really should not be illegal. And what is our responsibility to actually shift the laws? One example is, the laws that are still in the books in many states that said homosexuality is illegal. And any actual physical action is actually illegal. And so what is that responsibility to actually say, that actually is not a right law, and we need to do some of that work to shift and change? Or how we're talking about conversations about how we're creating space that's more open for others. So those conversations, all those interplay with one another. So justice and advocacy is a part of that.
It sort of reminds me of these laws that are ignored, and I'm glad they are, but I want to say that it sort of reminds me of what the president said concerning the troops. Don't ask, don't tell. So I just think that it's a very difficult political situation to get these laws modified.
Yes.
Or eliminated.
Yes. Yes.
In those states where they've been declared illegal, it was done so primarily because it was thought to be immoral, as we were conditioned to think by way of Judeo-Christian faith. I had the impression as a child that the church thought that homosexuality was a dire evil, and now we're in a church that says it's okay. Aren't there passages in the Old Testament that speak against it?
It depends on how you interpret the passages. Yeah. And a lot of those passages have been interpreted in that way, yeah. But there are other interpretations. And once you start to unpacking the passages, you start to see, well, that has to do with what lens you brought to your reading of it. But any of the, so I was thinking about, particularly if you think about which often this is Sodom and Gomorrah and those passage, but that actually, if you really look at what was actually really being talked about, this was about hospitality. That in that culture, the important thing to do was to welcome the stranger, because you're in the middle of the desert and going from place to place. Culturally, it was important that you provide a safe space for people to be able to go from place to place, because otherwise they'd be stranded in the desert and could die. And so the hospitality was an important part of the culture. And so the information that was really talked about was that lack of hospitality that they did not exhibit to the visitors coming in. That one line that could be interpreted whether they want to have sex with the visitors or not. I mean, there's some vagary in how you interpret the language. But the piece that's pretty constant is that they actually broke a law of the culture, which was hospitality and welcoming the stranger. And for me, that is the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so learning those passages actually is really important to realize the different ways that we interpret it. And I'm trying to remember, there's a great book that actually breaks all those down, and I can't remember. I see where it's sitting on my bookshelf, which is how I remember a lot of things. And it's called, I remember it's called What the Bible Says About Homosexuality, and I can't remember the author of the book. But it's actually a nice book that actually talks about the different passages and what they say and what they actually mean, and helps to put that.
But the article Pastor Jeffrey shared last week
Yeah,
also spoke to those passages.
Walter Wink's article addresses that, John.
Great. Yes.
I don't know if this is sort of a closet discussion about homosexuality, and if that's the main agenda of OWL, Our Whole Lives. It seems to be, so we've been in Unitarian churches for 20-some years before here, and seems to be maybe a significant part of the agenda of Our Whole Lives is facilitating sort of non-standard or normal or non-mainstream, whatever the word for that is, sexual everything, orientation, behavior, etc. But I would be interested in getting away from that, or at least not concentrating only on that, and hearing about OWL's overall mission rather than just promoting homosexuality, and also not spending the whole discussion on homosexuality, unless that's supposed to be the topic, and then let's just call it that.
Yeah.
So where are we on that?
Yeah. So that's not the center of the topic, and that's really, even that conversation with sexuality is an often one section in OWL, like one chapter in OWL, and there's a lot more broader. I think the best way to really talk about what OWL encompasses, and then we're going to kind of engage a little bit more conversation, is the Circles of Sexuality sex handout that you have, that really talks about the broader sense of what sexuality is and means in it. And so it takes the circle from, and it's actually, there's no particular order, but if you think about this, sensuality, intimacy, sexual identity, sexual health and reproduction, and sexualization. And all of those are the different areas that encompasses the larger part of sexuality. And they are, the way that the circles are all connected recognizes that they are all affect each other. And so it's a way of saying that, they're separate, but they're not that separate. Because all of those pieces are interrelated, and centered in all of those is understanding our values. And how our understanding our values engages how we approach and what we look at in each of those areas. And that is really the focus of OWL, is to really go through those areas of sexuality and say, so what is our understanding in this area? What do we know? What don't we know? What questions do we have? A key component of the program is the question box, and this is a box that at any time the participant can write a question on a card and stick it in the box, and then at the next session, then would read the questions that are anonymous, so that you can ask a question that you may not want to ask publicly in front of the group, but to have those questions named and answered, and opening up the space for those questions. And often what we'll do is we'll do the questions at the end, and everybody has to put something in the box, whether or not they have a question or not, just so that everyone is feeling like, no one feels like I'm the only one writing a question, the only one putting it in the box. But people can also sneak in and add a question at any time as well. And that's kind of the part of the recognizing that the kind of the self-worth is that we all have questions. We're not always, and as you were saying, JS, on the phone, about being, feeling that vulnerable, that this is that space, or there are ways of holding that space so that you can be vulnerable or ask the questions, or not let your own feelings or own vulnerability prevent you from getting the learning. And creating spaces for that. So what I would like to do with you today is do it kind of an exercise that comes out of the OWL program that's based on these circles of sexuality. And so I'm going to, what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of the different circles, and I'm going to scribe on here. I'm just going to have you shout out, when you think of that word, what comes to mind? And we're going to kind of compile our own understanding in each of those, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and other things that we might not think about or remember. So let's see. So let's start with sensuality. I am not the best speller, so I will. When I'm scribing, I'm not very good at spelling. If I'm like actually thinking I can spell things, when I'm scribing, I make mistakes. So if you don't understand what I wrote, feel free. And I will repeat things as well, just to make sure that everyone has heard things that are shared. So when you think of sensuality, what words come up for you?
Desire.
Desire. Okay. Feelings.
Feelings.
Touch.
Touch.
Visual. Sight.
Sight.
Sensitivity.
Sensitivity.
Pleasure?
Pleasure.
Pain?
Pain. Yep.
Adding to touch, that is the most primal, the most primordial of all sensations.
Mm.
It begins in the womb.
Touch is a very primal sensation, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Any other thoughts around sensuality?
I think of beauty.
Beauty, yes.
Imagination.
Imagination. Any other things?
Heat?
Heat. What about our other senses? We talk about sight, we talk about touch. What about
Sound.
sound, smell, sound?
Odor. Fragrance.
You got sound? What about taste?
Taste.
Any other thoughts? So when we think, one of the things to think about with sensuality is that it is all the ways that we engage, and it is about the senses and all those things. But it's also, I think, I was glad to hear beauty lifted up, because that it is what a sense of beauty and what we notice and how we experience the beauty and the imagination and all the ways that we are stimulated in different ways, and there are different ways to do that. One of the things as we go through all the circles is to think about too, these are all the circles are neutral. In a sense, is that how we engage them, that there are both positive and negative aspects in all of these. There are some that I think people have more of a negative association that we should lift up. You know, if something feels like, you know, there was a lot more of the positive sense around sensuality, but there are also, for each of these things, there's touch that's positive and then touch that is negative. And so also recognizing that this is kind of where understanding our boundaries are, is recognizing that the circles themselves are neutral, but how we engage them and how people engage them with us adds different layers of complexity. all of these. Yes, sir.
In this context, I think of taste as the ingestion of touch into the core of our bodies.
Mm. That is definitely a way of engaging and understanding taste, yes. So let's move to intimacy. What words come to mind when you think of intimacy?
Trust.
Trust? Love?
Pleasure.
Pleasure?
Sharing.
Sharing?
Trust.
Trust? Did you say trust, Jess?
Yes.
I did.
Great, thank you.
Personal.
Personal?
Safety.
Safety?
Private.
Private?
Togetherness.
Togetherness?
Bond.
Bond?
Becoming one.
Becoming one?
He said, becoming one in the sense of what we're going to do in church today. Communion
Communion?
with each other.
Communion?
Feelings.
Feelings? Anything else?
Openness.
Openness?
It's spiritual in a way. Of the 5 parts of this Venn diagram, it's the least physical. It's the most
Spiritual.
poetic or inward.
Any other words that come to mind?
Vulnerability.
Vulnerability?
It's right there. You have the word reciprocity. It can't be one way, as it is sometimes in a skewed relationship, unfortunately.
The reciprocity. Yeah, that all fits. Anything else that people have?
Equality.
Equality. Great. This is a good list, and now one of the things to think about as we talk about intimacy is that when we're talking about intimacy, we're actually talking beyond just a sex act, but the relationship and connections between one another. So there's intimacy in friendships. There's intimacy in collegiality. And family, there's intimacy. And so there is a broader space for understanding and engaging as we're understanding intimacy. And that's one of the parts of OWL, is that recognizes that all of our relationships, how do we determine, how, as we think about sexuality, what is the broader construct about how we are together in the space together that's beyond just the act of the sexual act itself, and those kind of times of when a lot of times like we in our youth and young adult cultures in Unitarianism, they have a lot of cuddle communities where they cuddle together, and that sort of sense is a sense of intimacy that's actually devoid of a sense of the sex act, but it's that connection. We talk a bit about, and this goes a little bit to sensuality, the skin hunger, that sense, that desire to be touched. And so the intimacy happens in sensuality, and we actually share some of the similar words on each one, and shows that connection, is that these are all interconnected. Check time as well. So the next I wanted to do, let's go to sexual identity. So when you think of sexual identity, what comes up for you?
Biologic.
Sorry?
Biologic.
Biologic.
Gender.
Gender.
Complexity.
Complexity.
Sexual orientation.
Sexual orientation.
Behavior.
Behavior.
Pronouns.
Pronouns.
LGBTQQII++.
I was waiting for
I
that.
think that's where complexity comes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Kind of what Lois Eve was saying, different traits.
Different traits.
Reaction.
Reaction.
Clothing.
Clothing.
Presentation.
Presentation.
Discovery.
Discovery.
Expectations.
Expectations.
Social norms.
Social norms. Yes.
I've been to some Unitarian churches. Will you please explain to me what binary and non-binary means?
Yeah, so binary, non-binary, refers to understanding of gender. So the idea of the gender binary says that there is only male and female. And non-binary says that, means that looking at gender outside of an understanding of male and female, that there is something broader that doesn't fit within those two categories. And that actually would fit under binary and non-binary.
Expression.
Expression.
Prejudice.
Prejudice.
Stereotypes.
Stereotype, yes.
Suppression.
Suppression.
Teaching.
Hmm?
Teaching.
Teaching.
Shame.
Shame. Anything else? I might add personal for this as well. And I think I will also add community, because I think that's part of complexity of it as well. I think complexity encompasses a lot around sexual identity, because there are so many different understandings and engaging, and it covers such a broad perspective and understanding. And there's a lot of learning that comes in understanding how people identify. And I do a sexuality section when I teach the boundaries class. And the conversation that we've had, I learned new terms in the class, because you're just like, I didn't, I mean, I kind of heard it, but I never really had engaged with somebody who had talked about asexuality and what does that mean. We've had a really interesting conversation, and these were ministers having a conversation about what it means to be in certain, what we identified as kind of kink, so like bondage and S&M, and be part of those communities and still be ministers. And how does that, how can they, or how can they engage in those things? And so there's really interesting conversations to have of how the wide variety of spectrum of sexuality and identities that people have within these different areas as well. And then when we talk about welcoming everyone, then how do we do that, recognizing the complexity of the identities that people are bringing in, and what is, what do we say yes to, and what does that mean? So it opens up a great conversation. So let's go to sexual health and reproduction. So keep track of it. What words come to mind when you think about sexual health and reproduction? Yes?
Well, all the ones on the circle come to mind, but if you just think about it in general, one of the first things that could come to mind of a kid, like when I was a kid, not now, but embarrassment.
Embarrassment. Teaching, yes. Prevention.
Necessity. Justice for women.
Justice for women. Responsibility.
Evolution.
Choice. Yes.
To draw this out, we come to the idea of homosexual reproduction. Talking about sexual reproduction, when you're talking to homosexuals about it, because they can't reproduce.
I would think maybe that would fall into a larger of, maybe I would say different, the different ways of reproduction. Because there's, different methods of reproduction. Control.
Immunization.
Immunization, yes. Drugs. Education.
Transmission.
Transmission.
Healthcare.
Healthcare. Access.
Acceptance.
Acceptance.
I'm just thinking like there's embarrassment, but it's also like, oh, that's what that is.
So anatomy.
Anatomy.
Balance.
Balance. Terminology. Research.
Education.
Education. Do you have education? Yeah.
Laws.
Laws, yes. Persecution. Anything else?
Fun. Fun.
Fun.
So Derek, we're down to about 5 or 10 minutes of them.
Okay, great.
Oh, abstinence.
Abstinence. Great, and I think this is...
Contraception then.
Oh, contraception. Yeah. Yeah. So this really section that kind of brings to light just a wide variety of, as we think about our sexual health and reproduction, that when we're talking about this kind of sexuality, that we need to also bring the health aspect to it and bring that's an understanding, and how do we also hold that space in our conversations and make sure that people know the basics of both anatomy, but also what is healthy and how to stay healthy and in that space as well. Right. So our last piece that we'll just kind of rocket through, and the time we have, is the word just went out of my head. Thank you. Sexualization. Yes, I was gonna write. It's like it's not sensualization. It's something else. Yes. So what words when you think about sexualization? Yes.
So Derek, rather than spending the last 5 or 10 minutes rushing through, you're sort of conducting a very rushed OWL forum here.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to save some time to talk to us about the OWL program and challenges that you face, reception to it, how it's received by kids today versus 20 years ago, where it fits in the church, anything like that? Or is this just sort of a rushed OWL seminar?
So I was going to do a kind of a little, and actually I'd look about time to talk a little bit more about it.
So
this is actually.
So we can go to 10:02.
Mm-hmm.
So that would give us 10 minutes.
Okay, because even if we maybe did a couple, just capture like a couple minutes of kind of words, and then I was going to do the last 5 minutes to kind of just talk about the OWL program. Because in some ways this is necessarily a plug for the OWL program, but about the conversations itself. So I'm not coming here to say you should do the OWL program, but more to actually have these sort of conversations and to think about how do you want to bring these conversations forward, which may be OWL, but there could be something else.
For us that didn't catch it, can you tell us more what the OWLS program is?
That's the Our Whole Lives Sexuality Education Program, the comprehensive sexuality program that's developmental from different ages.
Is it Unitarian Church?
And United Church of Christ.
Impressive from the outset, because this page looks like it was published for 7th, 8th, and 9th graders.
Yes.
And I hope we're doing as well as they did.
It's not entirely clear.
Yes, so the exercise is slightly different. This is actually from the adult exercise, 7th, 8th, and 9th graders. Actually, we don't do this particular exercise, but we use the circle.
But for junior high kids to start thinking in these terms.
Yes, we start using the terms.
Grades 7 to 9.
Yeah.
I should mention too, real quick, when Sarah and I thought about having Derek come in and talking about OWL, it wasn't because we have a plan to use it at this church. or even a desire to use it at this church. We just wanted you to know that somebody has already, for 20 years, had an all-age, comprehensive, faith-based sexuality program. It's because just the fact of that is worth celebrating, I think. And then when I found out that Derek is a certified educator in OWL, Sarah and I said, let's get him in.
Jeffrey, is it the only one of its type that you know of?
That I know of.
Yes.
Other churches do not have?
This is the only one that is actually, this is actually certified as the gold standard for comprehensive sex education.
Saw that written somewhere.
Yeah, so this is kind of the, I mean, there are other programs, but there aren't any that are comprehensive across the full lifespan. And so that's what's really important about it. And also that really incorporates and engages, that works both in the faith setting and in the secular setting. Yeah.
So do most churches have something aimed at adolescents or teens, but not at
If they do.
adult? Well, that's sort of, when you qualify by saying we're the only one that has sections for all ages, and I think
Yeah.
we listed maybe 5 different age groups, is that an oblique way of saying that there are many programs, but most of those are only targeted at a single age group?
That's probably more of a way of saying that I don't know what all the denominations do. So I know that what we
What
do,
do
and
Catholics
some.
do, just to go to the far extreme? Do they ignore it?
So there's often not in the Catholic setting. In fact, I just had a conversation with someone who grew up Catholic, and when I was saying that I was coming to do this presentation, she said, "You can talk about sex in church." And she actually said how different my life would be if I could have actually had that opportunity to have those conversations. And I think that there may be in other denominations some middle school thing, but more even just a conversation or a part of a class that maybe say, oh, okay, we should talk about, they might say, well, no, we're going to actually talk about different gender identity and have a conversation, but that's like a section in a larger conversation. But there's not really a sexuality education program in many other denominations that really actually sits there and has the conversation of, let's look holistically about what it is, not just beyond the sex act and the anatomy and all of that, but also, and our program does go into the full details of, let's describe the anatomy and understand, how does this physically work? And how does reproduction work? So what does how do we connect and engage with people who have a different gender identity, and what does that mean, and what might be going on, and how do we then provide support? So how do we engage? How can we be allies? How can we advocate around justice issues? How do we understand what is appropriate and what is not as appropriate? So there's just a full conversation that moves it away from, which is what I think that gets in the way for many churches, is thinking about the sex act itself and not wanting to engage in that conversation. But sexuality is so much broader. And to be able to have that space that says that as people of faith, we connect with people in different ways, and how do we understand that? And then how do we hold that space for when people come in with different sexual identities, come from different communities, and how do we as people of faith hold that space and welcome them in and accept them as they are? When we haven't had understanding, had a conversation that actually, where someone says I'm transgender, to come into the space and say, so I don't even understand what you mean. I mean, that's not very welcoming. So to be able to have those conversations, so when someone walks in the door and you can say, yes, I still may have some cognitive piece, but I understand what you're going for, and I can welcome you because I see you as you are, or how you present yourself. And that's some of the things I think is really important to be able, I think in terms of sexuality education, is how do we welcome the person who comes in the door, who may come in with an identity or an understanding that's not anything within ours, but we can at least find a way to connect with them and have some knowledge to be able to say, all right, I may not agree, but I actually understand the spectrum from which you are, out of which you're coming, and then we can have a space for you in this in the space. It's about that welcome. Yes.
I can't remember, but Is this like a year-long course or a half a year-long course?
It's a year-long course.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's like
pretty
nine months. Generally, it's like there's like going through. I mean, each one is different, and actually, I think the adult ones might be shorter, but definitely the like the middle school one and the high school ones are year-long courses. Yeah. Yes.
I was thinking that the acronym OWL might be a play on the word owl, which is an ancient metaphor for wisdom.
Wisdom. I think that I don't know that for certain, but that knowing some of the people, because I do know some of the people who put it together, I could see very much thinking in that way of this is a part of adding some wisdom around our sexuality and sexual wisdom.
Is there some way you could summarize quickly, this may take an entire another meeting, but how does this dovetail with what's done in our public education systems? I mean, there must, at least I remember my junior year in high school, all the boys were put in the gym and the football coach told us about all this in half an hour. You know, this is, and I don't know, I'm just curious how this, because that's another socially important way in which this wisdom is transmitted.
Right.
I would say, having been in the school system, I think a lot of this is covered in the educational system. And I think what's happened with the churches have said, well, it's being done in the educational system. And then our response is abstinence is the answer. I think that's many churches, that's the default, is let's just teach abstinence and we don't have to deal with it. Because the school system is really teaching a lot of the other stuff. And I think the school system is really doing a lot in terms of understanding not only anatomy as it used to be when you and I were growing up, but the whole range of sexuality and understanding that and gender and so on and so forth. I think they're doing a little
Including psychosexual, emotional, interpersonal.
Because most of the sex education gets into not only sexuality, but also the whole emotional realm of adolescence and so on and so forth. So I think they're doing a nice job of most schools are doing a nice job of that.
I think that depends on the school system.
At least at the high school level.
Yeah, I think it does depend on the school systems because I think there is a wide variety in school systems in terms of how they actually engage.
And probably also in terms of states too, so I would think in Texas, they're probably not doing that.
Right, because it's particularly with the laws around abstinence, and I will get to you. Abstinence-only education, which then, because one of the issues with that is it doesn't provide any education. I mean, it relates an unrealistic expectation that the kids are not going to be tempted and want to actually engage. And so what do they do how do we create a safe space? So if they're going to experiment, then at least they know things about how to use a condom, and know things to keep them safe. It's not necessarily saying, and OWL does not say, go have sex. It says, we believe that, it is not in your best interest to have sex as a high school student. But we also want you to be safe, that if you're going to do it, we rather you know how to be safe than to not know and then risk catching a disease, getting someone pregnant, and those sorts of things. And so let's have that knowledge there. And in places where there's abstinence-only education, they don't get the other piece.
So I'm a public school teacher, and I've actually taught the sex ed program for 1 year, as unqualified as I am. And I would disagree that they talk about the 5 circles that we discussed. The big focus was the sexual health and reproduction, the anatomy, contraception. There was maybe a slide on sexual identity or media, sexualization, stuff about the media. But the big information was on sex health and reproduction. And as a child, I went to the Robert Crown Center for that one and done thing, and that's still a thing. And again, it's when I taught it, it was a few weeks, and then the Robert Crown is a one-day thing. So it's not like a whole year program where they're going over all these different aspects.
What was the grade?
I was teaching 8th grade.
Yeah, I think it's very different from junior high to high school. High school, the high school is a whole semester course, so they can really, reach.
So we are now beyond 10:02. So let's thank Derek for being with us today. It was a very stimulating conversation. There's so much. Thank you for opening our eyes and hearts to this topic even more.
You're welcome.
And you all go in peace. Have a great week.
So they just have a thing where kids can put in questions.